Greetings and various assorted salutations. Welcome to another lecture on U.S. history. We're into the Second World War. What we're looking at is kind of what I mentally refer to as the darkest hours of World War II. Earlier we've talked about various origins. Now we need to get into kind of some of the more unpleasant aspects of it. Now, laconically put, at the start of World War II, the Axis powers believed in speed, surprise, and division among their enemies would allow them to dominate Europe and the Pacific before the Allies could effectively respond. That's the basic idea here. If we had to summarize everything we're going to be talking about today, that's what it's looking at. We've got a few learning objectives. We're going to look at how World War II initially unfolded in both Europe and the Pacific. We're also going to identify major challenges the Allies faced in fighting Germany and Japan simultaneously. We're going to look at the strategic importance of places like Australia and Britain in early Allied efforts. And lastly, we're going to look at kind of why the Axis thought they were going to win. Everybody thinks they're going to win. That's kind of how these things go. And we're going to look at why the Axis thought they were going to win, and we'll also mention why they were wrong. But let's dive in. So a few key terms and definitions I need to talk about. Blitzkrieg, of course, is probably one of the big ones. A lot of you have heard of it before. It basically translated very simply as lightning war. And the Blitzkrieg is just observed to be kind of a military tactic that is a rapid and dramatic departure from what we saw in World War I. We'll get more into it later. Axis powers are going to be the enemies: Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and Fascist Italy. The Allies are going to include people like the British Empire, the Soviet Union, China, and later the United States. Those are the Axis versus the Allies. There are other parties involved. The Axis powers have a few puppet states like Vichy France, for example. The Allies have friends like Canada and Australia to factor in as well, too. Another term, we're going to talk about it here, we're going to talk about it later, is the concept of air superiority. The idea of controlling the skies allows for a lot of military operations to be more successful. If your enemies can't effectively prevent your airplanes from doing whatever they want, that's what air superiority amounts to. Another term is Pacific theater. You're going to hear the word theater thrown around a lot. Now, what a theater is it's an area or region of combat. It means that there's going to be battles located in here. There's going to be certain military units that operate here and not other places. Theater also may encompass different challenges like climate, terrain, common enemies, and things of that nature. Stuff like that. Alrighty, first we have to start with the fall of Europe. This is why it's the darkest hours notes. When I say Europe, I'm referring to Western, Central, Eastern Europe, and North Africa as well. Since North Africa is largely controlled by European colonial powers, it kind of gets dragged into this as a European proxy in a sorts. Last time we talked about how Germany's invasion of Poland is the 1939 trigger for the European half of World War II. Shortly after that, we see Italy aligns with Germany with an intent of reviving a Mediterranean empire. The Germans have rapid expansion through Poland and other countries using blitzkrieg tactics. With this new German and Italian alliance, we see British colonies under direct threat and harassment by this new alliance of fascist powers. Now, to make things worse, initially the Soviets stay out of the Axis powers' way. The Nazi-Soviet Pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, pardon my pronunciations, is a 1939 non-aggression pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, which was a huge shock to pretty much everybody because ideologically speaking, the fascists and the communists hate each other. They do not like each other. This is hate, all capital letters. And the fact that they could set aside their differences and invade Poland and then Germany could really kick off World War II without having to worry about the Soviets coming in from the east, made things a real problem, especially in early World War II. Because 1939, 1940, the Germans can focus entirely on the British, the French, and their allies. Though this agreement, this pact will fall apart in 1941 with Operation Barbarossa, which in many analysts' eyes and many people's perception is one of the greatest helps for the Allies. Is the the fascist communist hatred is just, they couldn't overcome it and couldn't resist the urge to fight each other. This will push the Soviet Union into becoming one of the major allies, both in numbers and the efforts that they contribute in World War II. Here's a rough map of the war as it looks. Poland gets divided, and Germany is going to begin pushing into the west after Poland is taken care of. Now, it is alarming how fast the Germans expand in 1939. They just seem unstoppable. Poland falls in basically 28 days. Using a false flag operation where the Germans basically attack something like their someplace on the border, and then claim the Poles did it. They basically make up this excuse that they are just defending themselves when nobody really believes it. It's really suspicious when all your troops are on the border and it's perfect timing for an invasion. But it's 1940 when Germany really starts to assert its dominance. In April, Germany is going to push its way into Denmark and Norway, Luxembourg, Belgium, the Netherlands, and the British Expeditionary Force and the French get pushed back. They get pushed to the English Channel at the town of Dunkirk, and it is a nightmare scenario. Evacuating soldiers off the beaches of Dunkirk is a miracle, but it is not a victory. The only thing the British gain out of it is not a complete and total loss of all of their soldiers. France is kicked out of the war and falls to Germany in June, and Britain is going to then be under siege by air in the Battle of Britain. The Germany, Italian, Japan alliance, the Axis powers, are formally assembled in September, and it is just a nightmare. We'll go into more detail about some of these parts in class, but this is just kind of an overview here. Now, 1941 things aren't looking up. Germany begins expanding east, going into Yugoslavia and Greece. And the turning point, or what could be the turning point, is June 22nd with Operation Barbarossa. Germany and the USSR, the reason they got into that whole pact thing was they wanted to buy time. Germany wanted to build up as many resources as possible so that they could effectively overrun and destroy the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union didn't mind buying time either with the pact, so they could get their ducks in a row and destroy the fascists, the Germans, once and for all. But the Germans will make a lot of early advancements throughout 1941. They're going to push all the way to the suburbs of Moscow, and it is a nightmare scenario for the Soviets. Part of what makes World War II so different is how fast things are going. We learn about it in other U.S. history classes with World War I, that the war was very static. People dug in, they set up defenses, and they'd fight over those defenses for months, even years on end. But in World War II, the technology has caught up. You now have aircraft that can drop troops into battle. You can tow gliders and land the gliders behind enemy lines and launch attacks on them. You have tanks, you have half-tracks, you have trucks, you have the equivalent of jeeps, Kubelwagens. These vehicles all allow soldiers to be moved much, much more quickly. And what the Germans did is they developed a military doctrine around focus on supply lines, ignore strong points, hit supply lines, hit weak points, and flank or encircle your enemies and beat them that way. Why this tactic works is we live in World War II is an industrial war. World War I is an industrial war. The Civil War is the beginning of the one. And World War II is a very industrial war. Industrial war means that your militaries, no matter how good they are, how big they are, how well equipped they are, if they cannot be continually supplied, they'll run out of ammunition, they will run out of supplies, and they need a constant stream of fuel and equipment and ammunition to keep fighting effectively. And by breaking those supply lines, you basically then can starve out your enemies and surround them. That's why it's such a big problem. But to give you an example of this for World War II, you have the Maginot Line. The Maginot Line was built with the perception by the French that World War II, if there is a World War II, it would be much like World War I. The Germans would cross over the border trying to get into France. And so what the French did is they put up a fortification on the German-French border. The Maginot Line was state-of-the-art. Concrete bunkers, underground railroads, supply systems, radios, telephones, everything. It was a fixed defensive emplacement that could hold the Germans back for months. And it did work in that capacity. It's one of the last places in France to surrender to Germany. The problem is the Germans just went around it. They invaded through Belgium. They invaded places that the French had not fortified. They took Paris. They took out the supply lines. And then they could wear out the Maginot Line through a waiting game. That's what a blitzkrieg does. Ignore strong points. This leads us to one of the issues of early World War II. This is something we see, it's kind of anecdotal, but winners, when they prepare for the next conflict, they think back to how they've won before and prepare for that war. Losers look to the future and try to fix what they messed up in the previous war. That seems to be kind of a perception that comes up. With the fall of France, Europe is basically gone. It is either neutral countries like Switzerland, or it is occupied by the Germans. The Germans will set up a few puppet states like Vichy France, and only really Britain is left to fight on alone. This leads us to the Battle of Britain, which we'll cover briefly because this is intended for a U.S. history class. We're just setting up context for World War II before the Americans get involved. Well, involved directly. Anyways, Battle of Britain. With France gone, Poland overrun, Belgium, Netherlands, all those places are gone, the Germans begin looking at an invasion of Britain. It would be, if it had been carried out, it would have been called Operation Sea Lion. The first phase of the operation was to attain air superiority over the English Channel, basically launching out of new air bases in France and whatnot. The Germans would launch a punishing series of attacks. Initially, they targeted airfields, radar stations, but they'd also expand that to cities because the German Luftwaffe, that's the Air Force of the Nazi regime, they sought to break the will of the British people. Adolf Hitler felt, and many German leaders felt, that if the British could be bombed into submission, maybe they would give up, they would seek favorable terms, and once that was done, the Germans could then swing all their resources over to the Eastern Front and go destroy the Soviets and the Communists, as they really wanted to do in the grand scheme of things. What's going to make the difference, though, is the British people are incredibly resilient. Civilians, despite the Blitz, will hold out. If anything, the Blitz increased anger and frustration with the British and encouraged them to fight on, if anything. The other thing that helps is the British are going to take advantage of new technologies like radar to locate German bombers and take them out. And the British will hold the skies over Great Britain. At losses, there's going to be a lot of damage, there's going to be a lot of injuries, there's going to be a lot of deaths, but it's going to cost the German Air Force dearly in this bombing campaign. German logistics is just not in a position to run a sustained, prolonged bombing campaign across the English Channel. It's also important psychologically because the Battle of Britain is the first time the German war machine has encountered an obstacle it can't blitz around or run over. And Britain will remain key to the future of World War II because when the Americans come over, the island of Britain is basically an inassailable, unattackable fortress for which we can move our goods to Britain and then filter them into Europe for the rest of World War II. The Battle of Britain is a testament to the people of Britain's resilience, the technology and strategy and determination in spite of a near unstoppable war machine pushing through. Now we're going to shift over to the Pacific theater and the Japanese attempts at creating the Greater Co-Prosperity Sphere. The Japanese expansion is shocking, horrifying, and quite frankly, it's incredible how quickly they expand. Yes, a lot of their territory is ocean, but they take islands, they take territories, they take areas and bring them under the Japanese flag. This dotted line, it's not the best quality image, shows you the extent of the Japanese empire, which I think, according to some math or some geography, is like 1/8 of the planet Earth at some point, something like that. Now, the Japanese have been at war much longer than the Europeans have. Japanese expansionist policies can go back pretty far, but if we want to be technical, let's go with the invasion of Manchuria in 1931, which is more or less kind of the northern part of China. On this map, Manchuria is marked here. It's this area up here. The rest of China is going to be invaded in 1937. It is an unmitigated disaster. The Chinese are not ready for a Japanese invasion. For one thing, the Chinese are in the middle of a civil war of their own. They've been involved in a civil war, and so to be pushed in by a foreign invader just is all the worst for them. The Japanese will have extensive influence and control over Korea, what is now known as the island of Taiwan, Formosa, as you'll see in maps in the World War II, and many Pacific islands. The Japanese plan is very simple. Build up a powerful navy, set up a base of operations, and build a self-sustaining empire that doesn't need the outside world to keep itself running. And they want to kind of set this up before Europeans or the Americans decide to challenge them. They want to be basically, they're trying to stack the deck in their favor. Now, at some point, though, they run out of things to really deal with. They have to trigger war with the British Empire and the United States. And they're going to start with the perceived larger threat, the United States. December 7th, the attack on Pearl Harbor happens, which we'll discuss elsewhere in this course. But the idea of this is knock out the U.S. fleet. Best case scenario the Japanese have is if the Pacific fleet is gone, the Americans will be cowards and just say, nope, we're done. We give up. That was the Japanese hope. It's a bit naive in the grand scheme of things, and it proved to be very naive in practice. Hong Kong is the key financial British colonial capital out here in Asia. It falls in December. The Philippine Islands, which are U.S. territory, are going to be attacked heavily. The fighting is very ugly in this. The loss of the Philippine Islands will be a loss of rubber and quinine. In particular, two resources of note. The Philippine Islands were on a pathway to independence before World War II. It wasn't really a high priority in U.S. government policy, but losing it to the Japanese was definitely something that upset many Americans. General MacArthur is a big example of that. Also, you didn't want to be in the occupied territories of the Japanese Empire. The Japanese were quite notorious for their brutality. Singapore will also fall. But here's a more modern map of some of these places. Now, the Japanese are going to be very hard to fight because they are going to be very experienced. When we're getting involved with them after Pearl Harbor, you have to remember that some of these soldiers have been fighting for years. They've been trained by experienced soldiers who have been fighting for years. So even the new ones have some experience, or they have experience they can lean on. They control most all the Pacific Islands and important sea lanes. And it's going to be coordination between Navy and ground forces for this war. What makes the Germans and Japanese a bit different to face is the Japanese military culture is much more aggressive and much more willing to make sacrifices. It is considered a very great dishonor to surrender. And so Japanese soldiers are notorious in many stories for fighting to the very bitter, bitter, bitter end. They also are known for committing various atrocities and crimes throughout Asia and the Pacific during World War II, such as the massacres in Nanjing, the poor treatment of American and British prisoners of war throughout the Pacific, and things of that nature. Now, everybody thinks they're going to win. The Axis are convinced they're going to win because up to a point, if we're talking before, let's go with like 1940s, they haven't lost yet. The Germans acquired Austria through diplomatic means. They acquired Czechoslovakia through diplomatic means for the most part, like the Sudetenland. Poland fell in a month. Other countries, some countries fell in weeks and days. France is gone. And so those early victories really give the Axis powers a great deal of confidence. The Axis also vastly underestimate the Allied industrial powers. They expect Britain to surrender, and many assume that the United States, fed up with World War I and practicing isolationism, would stay out of the war. If they did enter the war, is why they presumed that the U.S. would take several years to get fully up and running, and American soldiers were generally considered weak. This was a similar thought that people had during World War I, is that the U.S. were not quite as tough as real European armies, like the Germans or the French or whatnot. And so there's kind of this this belief that American troops were not going to be the difference between victory and defeat. Now, why is this confidence misplaced? Well, American industry. The Axis had troubles waging wars in North Africa. They had troubles bombing Britain. They just didn't have the supply. They didn't have the production to easily, sustainably do this for long terms. The Axis were hoping that these wars would go quick, and American factories will not be bombed. They're almost nearly impossible to sabotage due to the extreme distances. And World War II is going to be all about logistics. Can you get your supplies? Can you get what your troops need, where they need it in sufficient or overwhelming amounts? And the Allies will do that time and time again. The Allies are also a lot more collaborative and cooperative. The alliance between the German and the Japanese is not particularly an efficient one. They're on opposite sides of the world. There's very few opportunities for the Japanese and the Germans to collaborate. Whereas like the British and the Americans, or the Americans and the Canadians, or the British and the Canadians, there's a lot of collaboration and manufacturing and exchange between each other that allows for the Allies to really work together and fight together side by side. A good example of this is in aircraft. American aircraft engineers were great at building incredible planes. Well, the British were really good at building engines. And the British would send their engine designs to the United States. The U.S. would put them in their new aircraft. They'd build these engines in the safety of the U.S. soil, and that's an example. I mean, there's all kinds of examples. The M1 Garand, which was issued by the U.S. military, was designed by a Canadian. There's a lot of that. The other thing that hurt the Axis is overextension. The Axis powers expanded very quickly, and the Allies kind of started attacking them before they could consolidate. there were many people who did not want to live under the Axis powers. The Japanese may have claimed to be uniting Asia for Asians, but the Japanese did not like the rest of Asia. There were many people in China that were persecuted for their race, violently in many cases, and so they were always going to side with the Allies. The freedom fighters in France and places like Poland, they will fight on in determination. When the Germans have to turn to slave labor for some of their production, well, the people they're enslaving are not that thrilled to be making weapons that will destroy the people, liberate them. And so the Axis really never have full control over the lands they hold, or it's a very tenuous holding, or they're always having to root out threats, and they can't trust people as easily. But no, so 1939, 1940, they're not very high points in World War II. The Axis seem to be winning on every front, and the Allies are being pushed back or knocked out. But the war doesn't end in 40. It's got 5 more years at the very least. So we'll talk about those in the coming days. That's enough for now. Until later.